Good morning, everyone. I'd like to start this webinar which focuses on thriving in the National Disability Insurance Scheme and to look at the roles for outcomes measurement. In terms of the presenter, my name is Les Hens. I'm being supported by my colleague Alison Raymond, who is a regional manager in Tasmania. And this is a series which is promoted and hosted by TasCOSS with the support of National Disability Services, Mental Health Council of Tasmania, Alcohol, Tobacco and Other Drugs Council, and the Department of Health and Human Services. So if we move on to the next slide, which is the goals for the for this webinar. The next slide. I hope you can all see the PowerPoint presentation. So in terms of the webinar, what we are seeking to achieve is an opportunity to share our work on outcomes measurement, and specifically to provide an opportunity for those organisations which are going to be active in public service markets such as National Disability Insurance Scheme, how they can actually use outcomes measurement as a driver for performance and success in their organisation. So we'll be covering a number of things, what outcomes measurement is and how it differs from other measurement activities, the alternative approaches to and best practice relating to outcomes measurement, some insights on how you can implement an outcomes measurement framework in your organisation, how you can use this approach to work with both the NDIS and also the DHHS outcomes framework. And we'll also take the opportunity to look at how other organisations have implemented outcomes measurement frameworks. Now the webinar, I'm going to be continuing kind of with a presentation which will cover why outcomes measurement is important, and particularly now. I'll take you through outcome measurement in its component parts. I'll take you through the theory of change, which is a fundamental foundation of outcomes measurement. I'll walk through some approaches to measuring change, how organisations can actually approach outcome measurement, and then finally, in terms of the presentation, once you've done the measurement, how you actually report those outcomes. Now, if you've got any questions at any stage, then please type it in and aim it at the Net Balance Organiser. And at an appropriate point, I'll try and answer the questions. But we've actually got a final question and answer session which will run for a good 20 minutes, so you'll have plenty of time to to think about questions and then to ask them, and we should have good time to actually discuss some of the key points. Okay, so the first kind of topic in the presentation refers to why outcomes measurement is important, and particularly now. Very rarely do you go through a presentation nowadays without Albert Einstein kind of appearing on a slide somewhere, and this is kind of no different to those presentations. We're in the process here in Australia of radical or disruptive change in terms of public service reform. The context has been increasing expectations in terms of the quality and access to services, increasing kind of frustration at the ineffective responses to wicked social problems. The Budget and National Commission of Audit and similar reviews in some of the states have clearly pointed to a divestment of the service provision role from government, actually kind of outsourcing or privatising that role to non-governmental organisations, whether they be private sector organisations, whether it be not-for-profit or indeed cooperatives and mutuals. The other kind of contextual factor is reduced tax revenues. We've not got anything like the austerity measures which are happening in kind of the northern hemisphere, but the reality is due to various things there's reduced tax revenues. So the upshot of it all is that there is going to be smaller government, whether it be federal and state. So in this, on the next slide, the reality for organizations is, to be honest, there's no such thing as business as usual. The ways that organizations have got used to engaging with funders and clients around traditional procurement processes are very much history. And we are now looking at a completely different context. So for you as organizations, it's really time to get on board and to recognize the sooner you get engaged in these new ways of delivering public services and new relationships with funders and clients, then the better. Now, in terms of what we've got used to on the next slide, the traditional kind of service procurement process, we got used to financial relationships being based on the government being both a funder and specifier of services. And organizations, like many of you, have got used to the process of being the provider of services, very much responding to the terms and conditions, contractual relationships with the funder. And on the back of that, therefore, performance or indeed success of organizations has been based on financial metrics and often activity and process metrics, including the quality of services, which is very, very important, and then often the delivery of specific outputs. So performance through acquittal processes, money's been spent, certain units of service delivered. Now, there's a fundamental problem with that, is that the most important stakeholder in this process obviously is the client or consumer or participant, beneficiary of a program, but they're very much just simply recipients of what is provided. And in kind of economics terms, this is called a principal agent problem, and the reason why it has worked relatively successful over decades is that there is a fundamental trust relationship between governments and the organizations providing services, especially not-for-profit organizations, and then similarly not-for-profit organizations have a trust relationship with clients, where clients can trust them because they've not got a profit motive to actually deliver high-quality services which they require. So if that's the traditional way of doing it, the next slide basically throws up the whole issue in terms of problems with this approach. I think all of us participating in this webinar will agree that financial measurement is a pretty poor measure of value. We're much more interested in the social value that we create for individuals and communities. But the bottom line, if financial measurement is the basis of funding agreements and so on, then the harsh reality is that resources get allocated to the things that get measured. So financial performance often is the driver of the allocation of further resources. And the big frustration for all of us is that in that process, the stakeholders that are most important, the recipients, participants in program, are left out of the decision making. They very rarely kind of get asked the most important questions around the quality of the service that's being provided. So in that kind of traditional procurement process, we all end up counting the number of participants, number of sessions, number of contact hours, number of projects completed, but crucially, sorry, on the next slide, then the big question is, so what? We know that's not actually what we're in the business of delivering services for. We actually want to deliver things which change people's lives. Okay, so the next slide. Sorry, next one. So our interest is in outcomes measurement. So this is looking at the bigger impact of your organization, the impact it has on not just the clients but the broader community and potentially other stakeholders. We're interested in significant positive and negative changes which relate to outcomes. It's always important to recognize that despite our best efforts, sometimes the desired outcomes are not achieved, and indeed there may be negative outcomes. So when we talk about outcomes measurement, we're obviously looking for significant positive outcomes, but recognizing there may be negative outcomes as well. We're also looking at short and medium term outcomes as well as the longer term outcomes. There's a continuum between you delivering a service, producing kind of outputs, and that having immediate change on someone's lives, but then the nature of that change actually progresses over the medium to the long term. And often what we're really interested in are the real kind of long-term final outcomes for people, which makes their lives better, quality of life, and other kind of key outcomes will be achieved. Now, in terms of the target beneficiary and other stakeholders, we're always very interested in ensuring that we cover kind of economic outcomes, social outcomes, and where appropriate environmental outcomes. We're aware that the nature of outcomes of different programs plays out very differently. You may have an outcome which is specifically around helping somebody deal with a potential kind of say anxiety issue, and by virtue of achieving that, they may feel that they're able to undertake training or economic activities to get jobs and so on. So often there's an interaction between economic and social outcomes. So just to kind of clarify then, when you're delivering a program, often we talk about the inputs and the activities, and then often using the old approach, we'd be recording the number of outputs achieved. But what we're really interested in are those kind of intermediate or immediate kind of outcomes of a program, and then the longer term outcomes. Now, there's a real issue with terminology here, because arguably outputs, intermediate outcomes, and then the longer term outcomes could all be kind of categorized as results. So we see lots of frameworks which refer to results, whether it be results-based accountability and some other kind of funding frameworks, but you really have to look at what the nature of the result is. Is it just another word for the achievement of a number of outputs, or is it to do with specific intermediate or the longer outcomes which the program is seeking to achieve? So you have to be very careful in terms of language and make sure you are kind of referring to the right particular type of output, intermediate outcome or outcome. Okay, so moving to the next slide. Well, what we've got now and what we're going to see more so in the future, and this is confirmed in terms of both the federal and state government changes, we're now talking about public service markets, where government is looking to facilitate, stimulate, and ultimately regulate the provision of services where there are a set of providers of services and then a set of individuals who are demanding those services, where increasingly the sovereignty, the power of decision-making actually is with the consumer. So moving away from the old relationships of government and not-for-profit providers to one where the actual consumers of services can actually choose which service provider they would like in terms of helping them achieve their outcomes. Markets tend to have two critical dimensions to them in terms of how they're organized. Often if we're talking about public service markets, then there's various kind of mechanisms, and the NDIS is a classic example with the National Disability Insurance Agency, which seeks to set kind of parameters around the supply of services and also the demand. So, but for you as organizations operating in that marketplace, then you clearly are having to operate in the context of whatever prices and levels of supply and demand are operating in that particular kind of marketplace, in terms of competitors. So on the next slide, I think it's important to recognize that the reason why this is such a key change for the delivery of services is the fact that at the core, the heart of this system is a person. And at the start of the process on the top bubble, and this is a slide which has got a build on it, so I'll just move around clockwise from the top, information and navigation. It's important that in this marketplace there is information which helps people identify which services are available and most appropriate to them. So on the next circle around the clock, then it is crucial that this whole process is needs-based and very much focused on the individual. Clearly the services have to be accessible to them and provided on a timely basis, and this is kind of particularly important in terms of the goals and aspirations of the NDIS, putting the person at the center of that system. And then you've obviously got, as we'll see on the next circle down, there are kind of a set of providers and planners and coordinators which kind of help an individual navigate through the system. And if we move to the next, we can move through to the rest of the bubbles actually on this slide. Then basically that allows not only to be service provision and provide support for an individual, for organisations to participate in the marketplace, but it gives you the basis for accountability, and then very importantly with a new system, the ability to review and assess the progress for both the consumers in the market and also the providers of service in the marketplace. Okay, so next slide. So basically what this means is that we've moved from the grey shaded area of a very narrow understanding of value for money with a comparison of inputs and outputs to a much broader program of activity where we're now interested in the wider outcomes of a program, whether it be economic, social, or environmental, and we're also much more interested in the range of resources which a program might use, not just the financial elements, but the people who contribute, the assets which an organization use, the offices they operate from, the systems inside the organization which help an organization deliver their programs. Okay, next slide. Now the upshot of this kind of broader approach to delivering services is captured in the new overarching performance management and accountability framework, which is operating now with DHHS in Tasmania. Funding agreement at the heart of it, where there are existing systems relating to quality and safety, and what we talked a lot about in terms of financial management. But the thing which is on the top of the pyramid and appropriate at the top of the pyramid is ultimately an outcomes purchasing framework, to ensure that services are kind of focused on delivering best outcomes for Tasmanians. So next slide. So if you look at the detail, and I'm not going to go through the bullet points on this slide and the next slide in detail, but the outcomes purchasing framework is another example of this fundamental change to the way that public services are delivered. And not only is it client-centered, but with a desire to kind of integrate service delivery, but it is something which is around strengthening the relationship between individual organizations and the departments for delivering services, and ultimately helping to better allocate resources and improve accountability. Now the next slide kind of reiterates the importance for the organizations to delivering services, trying to encourage the adoption of best practice, provide a platform for innovation, make sure that we're concentrating on the important things, and then for those who are able to attract additional funding, this particular approach will actually help you articulate value. So just kind of summing up on the next slide, there's a whole set of drivers for why, from an external perspective, measuring outcomes is so important and so important now. So we've got, at the one level, we've now got these client-directed or consumer-directed markets. So if you're able to articulate the value of the outcomes you achieve, then clearly that will help consumers make good choices and help them achieve their goals. In terms of government that's driving a lot of these changes, NDIS is just one example of client-directed care markets, which will become the dominant form. We've got increasing uses of results-based accountability, which uses very much a focus on, as I say, results, which could be outputs through to final outcomes. We've also got the emergence of payment by results mechanisms, of which social impact bonds, and other forms of social investment have occurred, and the Queensland Social Investment Framework, which has been kind of developed at the moment, is very much in line with this payment by results type approach. And then I think, as we all know, it's pretty crucial that we try and focus on the things that work, where early intervention and breaking the cycle programs tend to deliver those better kind of long-term outcomes than those programs which are just kind of activity-based and don't have that kind of critical element of focusing on the final outcome. And then in terms of the other kind of external drivers, we have got the adoption of social return on investment, RBA, the use of organisations with social impact statements as part of their annual reporting. So the real kind of drivers for organisations to adopt outcomes measurement. Now on the next slide, I provided some bullet points around the internal drivers, which interestingly to me, with the work that we've done and the series of workshops we did in Tasmania a few months ago, and work in kind of other states, one of the things which seems to typify what I call learning organisations, organisations which are striving to be successful, is that they've really embraced outcomes measurement and really kind of tried to provide a link between their organisational mission and then ultimately how they deliver their services and then how they measure their performance. And you can argue that measuring outcomes is the most important performance measure for any organisation. Now some of those organisations have recognised that in order for this to be meaningful, they've got to start to do some benchmarking their outcomes against other organisations, and a number of organisations have grouped together to try and kind of understand this journey and to ensure that they are ultimately achieving their goals, which is around being a high-performing organisation or a learning organisation. Just a couple of throwaway slides in terms of the next one. In terms of the investment in outcomes, focusing on outcomes, you've obviously got the Australian cricket team with a change of coach and a change of approach, very much focusing on your strengths-based, identifying one or two individuals, especially the guy on the right with the tash, who was underperforming, and by undertaking a program, turned him into not just a match but also a whole test series kind of winner. So that's focusing on individuals as a way of improving kind of outcomes. The next slide, another throwaway picture of the British Sky cycling team, which won Olympic gold medals and Tour de France a couple of times, where they actually focused on trying to improve every single element of their program, bit by bit, to ultimately deliver success. So when it comes to the process of measuring outcomes, it actually gives you the ability to enter into a learning environment, and if you capture that learning and feed the learning back into the system real time, then you can dramatically improve performance. Okay, so what we've done is kind of laboured the point that it's very, very important to measure outcomes, and especially now. What I want to do for the next kind of 20 minutes or so is just to run through the fundamental component parts of outcome measurement. And the first slide in this section just kind of reiterates that these fundamental components are quite kind of key to your understanding, but the definitions, this is still very much an emerging area, and the different definitions that are used for these key concepts can actually vary. So when you look at a particular kind of funding framework, it is important that you look at what definitions a particular funder or funding mechanism is using. And just for example, the use of the word results. As I say, you have to be very careful because it could be the outputs of a program, the immediate outcomes, or the long-term outcomes. And one of the most common examples is a result in the juvenile justice field is often the reduction in reoffending rates, recidivism rates. That's very much a desired kind of outcome of a program, but it's very much an immediate outcome. What we're really interested in is the long-term outcomes, which means that people who, especially young people who are not incarcerated or risk of incarceration, then hopefully they'll have high levels of confidence, be undertaking either education or work programs, and feel as if they have lots of confidence and much higher kind of well-being. The reduction in recidivism is just a method to get to those final outcomes. Okay, so the next slide, just to kind of cover off some of the key elements which we'll be talking about over the next few slides. We talk a lot about stakeholders, and that means kind of any actor that has an effect on or is affected by an intervention or a program. They can contribute to the change in an individual, or indeed they may be the individual that experiences a change within a program. So when we think about stakeholders, there's four basic types of stakeholder. As we've emphasized in this new kind of public service markets, the consumer will become increasingly the most important stakeholder. The funder or the funding mechanism is obviously absolutely critical, in terms of a stakeholder. You and your organization in delivering programs, and then clearly you are a stakeholder, but it's also important to recognize that in delivering a program you often have to engage with a number of other organizations to actually help deliver the service and achieve the longer term outcomes. Now this is something which tends to get forgotten in terms of the importance of other organizations, but the next slide just gives you an example of network analysis and how many organizations are interrelated. And when we've done this in workshop sessions, it's quite kind of fascinating how many organizations a single organization with a program has to engage with to ultimately deliver the outcomes for a particular kind of target client group. Whether it be the referral process, who might refer a person into the system. During a program, you may need specialist support, which is outside the competency or expertise of your organization, so you may kind of enter into a relationship with a provider of specialist services. And then similarly, when you've completed your particular role within an individual, you may then actually pass the person on to another organization to ensure that the outcomes are delivered and indeed sustained over a period of time. Okay, the next slide is a bit of, got to be pragmatic with all of this. You can't measure everything. This is a complex task, measuring measuring outcomes. So therefore, it's important to have a method of focusing in on the most important things, what we call material outcomes. And one way of defining that is by saying, if we didn't take into account a particular stakeholder, then would it kind of have a fundamental effect on the program? Would different decisions be made? And ultimately what we're looking at is a combination of relevance and also significance in terms of the outcomes. Now the reality of actually doing this work is an iterative process. You often have a broad view as to who the stakeholders are and how they engage. And what happens over time is through stakeholder engagement you can refine which ones are most important and fundamental to the delivery of the outcomes. So that's kind of a practical kind of tip, as it were, when you're actually kind of undertaking this type of work. Next slide. So as I've mentioned, that there are these different stakeholders, and it's important when you're measuring outcomes that you think about your organization as a whole in the first instance. And one way of doing this is to use a hierarchy of objectives, and many, if not most, organizations have either got a formally kind of articulated or in practice a hierarchy of objectives where there's the overall kind of mission of the organization at the highest level, but often then there's the next level down, there's a series of programs which help achieve their overarching mission. And then often within each program there's a set of tasks which actually kind of helps you deliver that program. And this is important because it not only kind of sets out the structure of the organization, but often it gives you some clarity in terms of how different programs combine together to achieve the overall goal of the organization. Now some organizations have got tens of programs, so it becomes quite difficult, but often when you look at the detail of the program, it is possible to cluster them into 3 or 4 kind of main headings. That to me is an important starting point, to have a clear understanding of how your organization is structured in terms of objectives. Now the next slide provides a couple of examples of organizations which have done this quite well, from organizations like Mission Australia, which has got 4 broad kind of program areas, issue areas, and has got quite a detailed kind of hierarchy of how they actually address those problems. And Good Beginnings, focusing very much on kind of early years. They've also got a well-articulated strategy which has got that hierarchy of objectives. So next slide. Now the next kind of fundamental building block concept of outcome measurement is the theory of change. Often this is where you seek to get a real understanding of the consumer or the client or the beneficiary. It is a method of depicting how a program is meant to work and what it's supposed to achieve, tries to kind of construct cause and effect relationships between the activities undertaken and the outcomes, recognizing the complexity of many issues. So it explores the how and the why. Sometimes it's called an outcomes hierarchy, and can actually be linked back to the objectives hierarchy if you so wish. And the theory of change is used when you're designing and also when you're evaluating programs. So theory of change is a fundamental building block of measuring outcomes. Now the next fundamental building block is the looking at the funder and the increasing use of results-based accountability. This is of increasing relevance because funders are there ultimately to achieve certain results for both individuals and the population as a whole. RBA is one particular approach to doing that. Unlike the theory of change, which tends to be much more iterative around the activities and then discovering outcomes, RBA tends to start by having a desired result or kind of end state, and then you work back to how you actually might achieve that. But like kind of a number of other methodologies, there's a good step-by-step approach to actually achieving that. Next slide. Okay, so bring it all together in terms of impact. What we're really interested in doing is, when you look at a particular program, is recognizing the added value of that program, the net benefit to society of delivering it. However, you've got a number of things which you have to be wary of in terms of the measurement process. First of all, no matter what you do and whatever program, a proportion of the outcomes you achieve would have been achieved anyway or through some other mechanism. So often there's a dead weight kind of element to the delivery of any program. So it's important to think and in the process of measurement to actually ask what would have happened if the program had not been present. Then, as mentioned earlier, you've got to recognize that often organizations don't deliver outcomes on their own. They like to attribute any change to their organization, but the reality is many organizations are often active in achieving outcomes. So you have to have a method of measuring that attribution. And similarly, you can deliver one particular program, achieve some outcomes, but you may only be displacing what would have happened kind of elsewhere. Displacement's another critical factor to think of when you're looking at the overall impact of a program. So if you look at kind of measurement of a program and you don't see measurements around dead weight, attribution and displacement, then the chances are it is probably kind of overstating the overall achievement of a program. Okay, the next slide goes back to the DHHS Commissioning for Outcomes framework, and this is just to say those fundamental building blocks that we've just gone through well and truly kind of feature in the kind of outcomes purchasing framework, which is great because it means that it is well founded. Okay, the next slide just recognizes that the measurement of outcomes is very much a principle-led approach and is not around using any particular methodology or any kind of set of tools. Ultimately, there are some fundamental principles of which we've covered. Involve your stakeholders. Make sure you undertake a theory of change to ensure that you understand what is going on, and then whatever you do in terms of measurement, you don't get distracted by not including the things which cause a problem. Okay, I'm just going to spend a few slides on the theory of change, which is the next section. Next slide. Okay, and then the next slide is the what the theory of change looks like, and it is fairly straightforward. You see it in many kind of program design kind of processes, and when people kind of describe their programs, there's a description of the inputs which are used, the activities undertaken, the direct outputs which are achieved, and then an articulation of how those how the longer term outcomes are achieved. Now, the key thing here is this is typically delivered through a workshop session involving key members of the delivery team in the first instance, and then broadening it out to other stakeholders. And what it ends up is being an iterative process where you're continually trying to understand what the final outcomes are. We all get distracted because of their previous kind of experiences in terms of funding mechanisms, of looking at activities and outputs. Once we start saying, well, what does a particular output mean to an individual, how does it change their lives, then you end up exploring this, these longer term outcomes in a very iterative fashion. And you may identify some immediate outcomes, but ultimately you really are interested in those longer term outcomes. And the example I gave earlier around recidivism is a classic example where in workshop sessions often people think they've done their job in terms of theory of change by saying what we're really interested in is reducing the levels of reoffending. You then just have to remind the participants that they're doing that program not just to achieve that specific result, as it were, from a program, but ultimately what stems from that reduction in recidivism in terms of the confidence of an individual and their economic and social outcomes by not being incarcerated. Now, what you've got on your screen, an example of what a theory of change kind of looks like when you put it into diagram form, where you, just to take the top line as an example, you may be providing secure and affordable housing as an activity, a kind of an output which often gets measured for funding purposes is the access to housing, and specifically the number of units of housing for a particular kind of client group. But when we've gone through the theory of change exercise with the relevant stakeholders, we've identified that the intermediate outcomes are increased sense of personal safety, decreased kind of financial stress, and then what that means in the longer term for the individuals is an increased sense of security. And if we look at the other component parts in terms of the activity and the outputs which are achieved, then what we can do is actually identify kind of long-term outcomes relating to improved personal health, increased employment readiness, and increased community inclusion. So some very, very kind of fundamental long-term outcomes that can be achieved. Next slide. Okay, so one of the approaches which uses theory of change at the heart of its method is the social return on investment approach, and it's used for a range of different reasons, but often it is around how effective money is spent. It's a way of comparing the value of change created to the investment in that change process. It is, I suppose, an enhanced version of cost-benefit analysis, which often is something which Treasury departments within government agencies feel very comfortable with. So that's often a way to describe it, is that it's an enhanced form of cost-benefit analysis, which looks into the broader economic and social and environmental outcomes of a particular program. It is specifically around measuring outcomes and therefore not outputs. We focus on the change for stakeholders, and then crucially, and then the thing which makes it different from other approaches, it seeks to actually measure the value of any change by use of financial value. So that means you can actually combine financial value with social value, broader economic and indeed environmental value, because you can use a financial proxy for that broader type of value. Now, SROIs can be done retrospectively if you want to do evaluation, or you can do predictive and forecast how a program might create value. So this is one particular approach. And then on the next slide, as I mentioned, nearly all of these approaches to outcome measurement are built on principles, as well as kind of having kind of component parts, different tools to help you do it. But these are the drivers of SROI: involving stakeholders, understanding what changes theory of change, value the things that matter, the materiality question, do not overclaim, make sure that you've taken into account dead weight and attribution and displacement, be transparent in terms of how you've done the calculations, then ultimately verify the result. On the next slide, SROI in terms of a step-by-step approach, very much kind of reinforcing the principles in terms of first step around stakeholder mapping and understanding the key stakeholders, identifying outcomes through the theory of change. Use that process also to think about what may be important indicators of measuring change. Then you have a change which is a stage which is valuing that change in terms of financial proxies, and building an impact, an understanding of the impact on the lives of individuals, put it into a model, and then you report it. Now on the next slide, one of the distinctive features of SROI is the translation of social value to financial value. Many outcomes create value, but typically it doesn't get recognized because it hasn't got a dollar value. However, as I mentioned, we're in this fundamental change in terms of public service reform, and it's in a broader setting of changing from what Michael Sandel has called a market economy to a market society, where he argues basically anything can have a financial value placed on it. And examples are, in the States, every child who reads a book gets a $2 reward for reading the book on the basis it contributes to long-term outcomes in terms of literacy. So how do you actually going to go about using financial proxies? The theory of change process gives you an opportunity to ask people themselves in terms of what financial value they might actually place on a particular kind of change in their lives. So that's an important component. But cost-benefit analysis over decades has developed a number of different approaches to how you're actually going to measure value and indeed convert it into something which can actually have a dollar value. And I've just listed a few examples here, and like elsewhere, there's links for you to explore kind of further information. The next slide is one of those things which often gets used, is the quality adjusted life years. This notion that a program can actually help people kind of live longer and to live well longer, and obviously kind of that has got kind of significant value. So there's a number of standard techniques, but quality of life years is one of the ones which often gets used. Okay, then moving on to the next methodology, which is most commonly used when we're looking at outcomes measurement, is results-based accountability. And as I mentioned earlier, this is very much kind of starting with the the final result in mind, but it is a very, very practical approach, and one which looks at the population, tries to kind of describe the change which is sought in very kind of plain language without any jargon, looking very much for the achievement of specific results, the indicators which might be a good way of actually measuring those results, very much a focus on the quality and the quantity of services delivered in relation to achieving those results, and then typically, like most measurement, there has to be a baseline against which you're measuring. It's important to note that we talk about lots about numbers, but both SROI and also RBA, there's a pretty strong kind of emphasis on capturing the stories, the narrative, which goes alongside the process of measurement. So the next slide is just a pictorial kind of representation of what RBA is in terms of how you're actually going to go about kind of building up the information, and once again there are links to actually how you can do that. Okay, next slide. Okay, so just kind of pulling together, we started off with the theory of change. It's been a kind of fundamental building block and very much kind of common to SROI and built into the RBA method. It's important that you do that so what challenge to make sure that people do explore those longer final outcomes rather than stop at something which is much closer to an output. But you can't do everything. This is a complex task, so do that materiality check and focus in on the things which are most important. You probably need to segment stakeholders to make sure that you understand how a program might kind of play out with different people. Make sure you explore the counterfactual, dead weight attribution and displacement. And I think it's quite helpful to actually look at theory of change from both an SROI, focusing on the outcomes for individuals from within the program, to also the RBA approach, which is more of the population based. Okay, so moving on to the next section, measuring change, and with the first slide in that section, we've already said that the measurement component is absolutely fundamental, because ultimately resources are allocated and often the accountabilities relate to what can be measured. So our argument is we need to move away from the financial and output and activity-based measurement to one which is much more around material kind of outcomes for stakeholders. And in terms of one of the warnings here, often there's a realization this is quite difficult, so you do end up defaulting to what can be measured, but that may not actually be the most important thing. So it's a bit of a trade-off, but it's important to try and measure the things which are most important, which are those longer-term outcomes. So in terms of the key questions when you're doing measurement, how do we know how many people have experienced this outcome, and how do we know the extent to which this change has taken place? So those are the fundamental questions which you take into any kind of quantitative measurement of change. Next slide provides some kind of basic principles when you're doing quantitative work. I mean, ultimately we're measuring change, so there has to be a baseline and then a follow-up as one particular approach, but it may be that you only have one chance to actually capture change information. So you ask the person who's been a participant in the program whether they've got better or worse on a particular issue over a particular time period. It's called retrospective construction, and it allows you to kind of capture those 2 points in time in one go. Once again, this requires a lot of thought and care in terms of how you pick the questions and over what time period, but it is possible to capture self-reported change over that period. When you're doing the quantitative work, this is the opportunity to build a counterfactual. In an ideal world, maybe we'd be doing in order to do that, to have a control group, but the reality is that's pretty difficult to do. Therefore, you have to construct counterfactuals using either population level data or by asking participants in the program what would have happened if they'd not received particular help in a program. So once again, the self-reported option is there as a pragmatic response if you're not able to undertake a more robust process with a control group or an external kind of population measure. In addition to the dead weight question, you need to ask about attribution and displacement. You have to kind of tackle kind of difficult issues around how many people do you need to include in any kind of quantitative survey. Once again, I think you have to be pragmatic and, where possible, kind of use as much administrative and client data as possible. If you are doing surveys, then make sure you pilot it and test it so it it kind of works and gives you the answers that you're looking for. You may need to incentivize people to participate, and then finally you need to make sure and check to see whether you need ethics approval, and personal consent, in terms of participation in this type of data kind of collection work. Okay, next slide. Okay, so what we're trying to measure in the quantitative work are usually some indicators which relate to those important outcomes. Often these can be the processes which relate to immediate or intermediate outcomes, things which are tangible, measurable within the short term, and are suitable to be called an indicator. The reality is you may not have access to all the data you require, so you have to be pragmatic. It is better to pick an intermediate outcome which has got some robust measurement than potentially having to wait a long time and using a longitudinal study to get the longer term measurement. Next slide. Just an example of what indicators you might use in a particular setting. This is an example of a new resident in a community housing development. The intermediary outcome which they're looking for in this program is interaction with fellow residents. The final outcome is reduced social isolation. There are a number of potential indicators that they could come up with in terms of the number of meetings or groups the person attended, the number of neighbours they know by name, number of adults who feel comfortable calling on their neighbours for general help, and so on. So this is where you have to be pragmatic and pick an indicator which you feel is the best, in terms of describing the pathway to those longer outcomes. Next slide. So when you're actually building kind of the indicators that you're going to use for measuring kind of outcomes, you want some kind of combination of objective indicators, things like number of health clinic visits, are tangible, can be recorded, versus the more subjective indicators, which are around self-reporting on physical health. Ideally, you want to try and identify these lead indicators which you feel are robust and indicate that somebody's on the way to achieving the longer term outcomes. And then crucially, if you're using a particular kind of funding program, to have a good understanding of what the funder thinks of as a result, and then usually that will have an indicator attached to it. Okay, so next slide, if that's the the challenges in terms of measurement, in terms of indicators, and identifying the different approaches in terms of creating a baseline or retrospective. One of the key elements that we use in quantitative measurement is the concept of distance travelled, the degree to which a person is on the pathway to achieving kind of outcomes, and you can use a range of scaling to suggest that people are on different stages of that journey pathway to delivering the outcomes. And here's an example of an outcome star, which is a great way of actually presenting that progress against each of the dimensions here. The number one, the top, motivation, taking responsibility, a series of questions which allow you to say what their current level of achievement is against that, and how it might have been, say, 6 months ago before they started the program. And it's a great way of visually kind of presenting the information as well. Next slide. So just pulling that two together, if you're going to do this quantitative measurement, then you probably need to use more than one indicator. Certainly kind of have a good balance between objective and subjective. Using the distance traveled is a great way of actually measuring a lot of the outcomes which are relevant in kind of care markets and things like NDIS. And just kind of reiterating, don't kind of measure the simplest things, the easiest things to measure. They are probably often not the most important. And also think about who's actually doing the measurement and who's actually been asked the questions in terms of the person themselves or their agent, staff member, your carer, or indeed a family member. So there are various ways of doing the quant work, and it needs kind of careful consideration. Okay, next slide. And when you're undertaking this quantitative measurement, you must make sure you maximize the utility of existing data. And there's a whole raft of data sources, and the Australian Bureau of Statistics, not only does it hold a lot of data, but it also often provides kind of great definitions of things like outputs and outcomes. So it helps you make a lot of progress quickly. Don't think you're starting from a blank sheet of paper. There's often, some good research that's already been done there, and some good measurement with robust definitions. So those are some examples of other sources of information. Next slide. So basically, there's a good practice around how you go about this, and some don'ts. I won't go through them in detail, but it's important that you try and adhere to the best practice in terms of the quantitative work, and try and avoid some of the negatives which can actually undermine the quality of what often is a lot of hard work. Okay, so that's finished that section in terms of measurement, and it was obviously quite dense and a lot of detail, but there are some links to resources at the end which are going to help you. The next section is just really to help you think about, as you approach measuring outcomes, how to actually kind of take on this challenge. And the first slide in this section just basically says there's no best approach. Methodologies have got strengths and weaknesses. You really need to work out what's important for you. And it's your needs ultimately the ones which should drive that decision. And indeed, you may end up using a combination of different approaches in order to answer your particular needs in terms of outcome measurement. But whatever happens, I think we'll go back to those principles and say it's essential that you involve stakeholders. It's essential that you understand what has changed, and you understand your impact and added value, and take into account things like dead weight. Next slide. So if you are kind of thinking of outcomes measurement, what are your needs? If we're talking about the NDIS, then being able to systematically measure outcomes means that you will be able to send signals to consumers in the NDIS market space, in terms of what your program services deliver in the long term, for individuals who use your services. You may also have reporting requirements. You may have other kind of communication requirements to other stakeholders. You may just have this kind of internal desire, to understand how you kind of create social value. You may want to improve your programs. You may want to improve your fundraising kind of strategies and so on. Or you may actually want to use this particular approach to advocate for change. Next slide. The next kind of crucial thing in terms of understanding your needs is basically what scale do you want to know this? Do you want to start at a project level or a program, with a number of projects to tackle this at an organizational level, or if you're operating in a network of organizations, or indeed whether this is something which should be done at a market level. Our advice is always to start small and stick a boundary around it whilst you're kind of learning how to do this and you're building the internal capacity to do it. So if that's the kind of the scope of the measurement, you also need to decide whether you're interested in understanding the past or what you're currently doing, or whether you're actually in the process of designing a new program and you want to do the thinking around the theory of change and how value might be created. A lot of what we talked about is understanding and describing things, in terms of theory of change, and then we spent a lot of time actually kind of measuring things in terms of the quantitative side of it. So once again, you need to decide whether it's important to develop the understanding or whether you need the hard numbers, and then that will determine what's required. And then also whether this is something which is going to be done as a one-off snapshot or whether you're actually going to continue ongoing. Okay, next slide, and we're almost at the end. So having kind of scoped it and decided on it, you need to look at your own internal capacities to undertake the work, whether you have the staff with the right skills, whether you have real opportunities to capture the type of data that's required. And then I suppose once again pragmatically, is this something which you can actually do step by step? So you're not actually kind of taking on the whole challenge in one go, and you can actually, through building blocks, say with the theory of change, start there with a particular program and then build up the information over time. Okay, next slide. Now, I'm not going to go through these, but we're just kind of giving you a bit of a snapshot in the next 3 slides on the strengths and weaknesses of different approaches. I'll say each of suits different circumstances. Is up to you and your organization's needs which one actually fits. So the first one is on SROI, and if we move to the second one, it's on RBA, and then we've brought them on the next slide together into a bit of a table, in terms of how the strengths and the weaknesses play out across the 3 different methodologies. And I'd argue once again here, there is no harm in actually using a combination of these things. Theory of change actually kind of fits with both RBA and SROI, and if you're looking at population level information, then RBA has got great things to offer, but if you really want to understand how an individual's life has changed, then maybe the SROI approach may be better. Okay, so next section, having done all that measurement, done all that understanding of a particular program, reporting outcomes becomes absolutely critical. There's no point having done all that work if you don't then actually kind of report it. Just an example for you to look at later from the MLC Foundation and Lifeline Research Foundation, in terms of a particular program, their crisis support chat, in terms of the outcomes that they identified for the service users. They provided the information on that particular kind of SRI study through a flyer, a report, and a presentation, different formats. The next slide gives you the crude hard numbers in terms of social value created, and then a ratio in terms of the $8.40 for every dollar invested. But if you look at the table, it also kind of records that some of that value is in the term of cost savings to government in terms of the medical and emergency help services, as well as helping the individuals who are at high risk, avoiding crisis, and those on the medium and low risk. Now the next slide is a way of presenting all of that information on one page, an infographic. Increasingly, this is what organizations want to achieve in terms of their programs, to be able to have in one page clarity over the outcomes which they're seeking to achieve, and then the various kind of activities and outputs and intermediate outcomes that are required to achieve those big long-term outcomes. Next slide. Okay, and then there's something which looks a little different but contains a similar body of information, which is an RBA report, which kind of records the change against the key dimensions and provides a lot of information in terms of how that change was achieved, and once again try and put things on a page. Okay, so what we've done over the last hour and 5 minutes is kind of go through very rapidly the reasons why you'd undertake outcomes measurement, the fundamental component parts of outcomes measurement, a couple of different methodologies, and then the importance of reporting outcomes. The next section is on what next, and the first slide basically we believe that outcomes measurement is fundamental for all those organizations which are operating in client-directed care markets, especially kind of NDIS. As you're all probably painfully aware, NDIS will become a market with multiple service providers competing for clients. And obviously the NDIS kind of system is around trying to help individuals achieve their goals and aspirations. It's not just about them accessing the services that are available, it's about them defining what they wish to achieve, and the various component parts of the system which kind of help the individuals through planning and coordination kind of access the right services. Looking forward, the evidence of impact will make decisions easier in terms of value for money, and the whole kind of functioning of the NDIS will be very important. I've had the privilege of doing a fairly major piece of work with National Disability Services in New South Wales, with New South Wales government funding to develop a social impact measurement system, which is trying to kind of recognise that many organisations are faced with the similar challenges in terms of communicating to clients, prospective clients, and having a standard approach would be attractive, but very much early days in terms of how this might work. So the next slide is an example of what an outcomes measurement system might look like across NDIS, where ultimately people have got aspirations, goals relating to their physical and personal kind of well-being, desire to be parts of communities that have belonging, and also their learning and growth kind of goals around becoming. And so this is very much what the future will look like. Now, on the next slide, and then these are the last two slides before we can open it up for questions. None of this is easy. We've got all those external drivers, and it's very, very complex on how we actually go about it, and complexity can be dealt with in a number of ways, including kind of working with other organizations, or making sure you maximize the use of existing evidence, and especially from organizations that are operating in similar fields as your own. That the funding systems may not be asking for data or generating the data that you need around outcomes measurement, and the fact you may have to develop your own, but clearly ideally it would be best if we had a standardized system which wasn't just around activities and outputs and funding, but was a way of actually ensuring that kind of outcomes are the most important kind of measurement of success in a public service market like NDIS. So those are the external challenges, but there are also internal challenges on the next slide, which is around an organization's capability of undertaking this work in terms of expertise, competency and capacity to do this work. And we argue that ultimately this requires capacity building and perhaps the use of co-production approaches to build that capacity over time. And similarly, organizations really need to develop internal systems to facilitate this. So the use of case management systems, which can be used as a basis of systematically capturing outcomes type information from individuals, is very important. And then finally, the biggest kind of challenge is often around costs, but the reality is we argue that this shouldn't be seen as a cost. It should actually be an investment for your organization, because it gives you the means of not only progressively improving the performance of your organization, it is the method of ultimately communicating with that broader set of stakeholders, where the consumer obviously is the most important. Okay, so apologies for an hour and 5 minutes of solid presentation, but there was a lot of ground to cover, and I know there's kind of a range of questions which have been asked, but hopefully we can spend the next kind of 15 minutes kind of answering some of those questions. One of the questions early on was around net balance, actually. There was an introductory slide. Net balance is currently, for a very short time, a dedicated sustainability consultancy firm working across environmental and social sustainability. But on September the 19th, it will become part of EY, Ernst & Young, but still undertaking the same program of environmental and social sustainability work. And I'll just kind of carry on with one or two of the questions which I've noted. I may have scared some of you off in terms of the complexity and whether this is much more suited to a university study rather than operation within a not-for-profit organisation delivering services in the NDIS market. I think the building blocks can be quite complex in terms of how you understand them, but it's important that ultimately the pragmatism, materiality, the things which are possible are the things which you use to prioritize your kind of investment in undertaking this work. I would say try and maximize the use of any academic research that's been done, any evaluations that have been done, but ultimately this is something for you as organizations to develop to meet your needs. And through the use of advice and peer support from organizations which have gone through this and use of the toolkits which are available, I think you can actually kind of make it manageable. So are there any other questions which okay. Yeah, well, there's a question, I think, from Rachel, which is around, do you think there's a space for service providers to develop up their own measures to report rather than the templates or the current kind of funding requirements? And my answer to that is fundamentally yes. You've got to measure the things which are most important to you and your organization, but in the process of doing that, you need to take into account that you do fit in with any kind of funding requirements. And I do believe you can actually do that. Often the requirements in terms of reporting are very standardized and simplified, and they may not just have the level of detail that you and your organization require. So if you're building up that kind of basket of kind of indicators around the outputs of a particular program, then the immediate or intermediate outcomes, then longer-term outcomes, it may be what the funders and other external stakeholders require may be a lot closer to the outputs kind of end of the spectrum, whilst you may be much more interested in capturing some of those indicators which suggest a person is on the pathway to those longer-term outcomes. We will be providing a copy of the presentation kind of after the presentation, so you'll have a chance to look at the detail, and at the end of the presentation there's a set of slides which give you a list of resources to how you can kind of implement things like theory of change workshops in your own organization, how you can access different methods of applying financial proxies. There's a set of resources which are available. Okay, so in terms of Tim, in terms of can you give examples of measurement tools that either clients or frontline workers are finding useful themselves, not just administrative burden? This is the big challenge in terms of implementation within organizations, and why I encourage potentially a step-by-step approach. If the measurement tools are not well designed, then the chances are either the client or the frontline worker will think that this is purely an administrative task and it's not ultimately helping the organization improve and provide better outcomes to the individual. So it is vitally important that in using measurement tools or developing measurement tools, that those frontline workers and indeed clients through stakeholder engagement activities are directly involved. to make sure that the tools that are developed, the templates which are used, the questions which are asked, are directly relevant to the particular program. That these things take quite a long time to develop and implement, so it's best that they're not seen as imposed from above without any recognition of the reality of a service. And certainly the NDS social impact measurement tool was very much kind of built with that in mind. Okay, question from a bit earlier in terms of, I think question from Alice ultimately via Tim. So in terms of the, I mentioned the importance of a counterfactual in terms of understanding what would have happened if the program had not been delivered. This is something which is ultimately a very important kind of aspect in understanding how a program delivers. And I know we've mentioned before whether this is an academic study or not, but it is something which can be asked simply through questions in terms of asking a person what they would have done if they'd not got access to a particular program. Okay. I'm following on from the discussion around in terms of making sure that any kind of template or tool is not seen as an administrative burden. It has also got to be a tool which can be implemented in a short space of time. And once again, from our own work with National Disability Services, we boil down kind of outcomes to around 21 questions, but many of those questions would only be required in certain circumstances. I think that's the reality is it has got to be something which can be delivered within, say, typical kind of engagement with a client and can't be seen as a huge burden in terms of maybe a 15-minute kind of discussion, not kind of a 1-hour in-depth interview. That's kind of the type of balance. Okay, I'm not sure if there's any other questions, but if we have 5 minutes or so left, so if anybody has any further questions, do kind of type them in. Okay. So let's kind of conclude. The next slide, actually, we've just got a couple of concluding slides. We set out some goals for the webinar at the beginning, and on the next slide, I'll just kind of run through in terms of what we were seeking to do. Through this webinar, we're seeking to help you gain knowledge and resource on outcomes measurement and understand how this will help your organization thrive in the public service markets like NDIS, and that we've covered what outcome measurement is and what it isn't, the alternative approaches, how you might implement such an outcomes measurement framework, how it relates to NDIS, and also the DHHS kind of outcomes framework. And we've also provided a set of examples of organizations which have undertaken this work, so you get a sense of how they've gone about it. So the slide pack, when you get it, will have a series of slides which will give you access to resources if you do want to kind of delve in further detail. We hope that there'll be a mechanism for people to continue the dialogue around this particular topic within Tasmania, and hopefully Tim and TasCOSS will have some news on that shortly. There's going to be some further webinars that we're going to be running over the next couple of months on topics which people identify as being important to them in terms of considering outcome measurement and its implementation in their organization. So I hope we've achieved some of the goals of the webinar. We're very happy to receive further kind of questions kind of after the session. You will be receiving a hard copy of the presentation, and there'll also be a tape of the audio of the presentation as well. So if there's no further questions, then I think we can close the webinar down. Thank you for participating. Apologies for those who may have had problems with audio at the beginning, but you'll get a tape later on. And thanks for all the questions, and have a good day.